My name is Spencerus Andronicus Clavanicus, son of Andronicus, no relationis, servant of the true emperor, Marcus Aurelius, champion of the book bros, leader of the analog armies, and I will have my vengeance in this life or the next. Are you not entertained? One way I know I'm getting old is that even my awesomest pop culture references are becoming a little bit ironic and quaint. It was so depressing teaching Roman history this spring semester because I was doing this whole rant about, I guess, Blake Lively and how she's sort of like Lesbia from the Catullus poems, and the whole drama in the poems is sort of like the thing between Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni after it ends with us. And I thought it was so hip and cool. I was like, wow, I'm the best teacher ever. And I got to the end of it, and my students all looked at me like, who are you talking about? It's like, I thought this was current affairs, but of course their celebrities are all on TikTok. I have no idea who any of them are, what musicians they're listening to. I'm completely lost the plot on that. It's a lucky thing that I've always said Young Heretics is about youth in spirit and not in reality, because I never predicted that aging would happen to me. Anyway, that was a famous speech from Gladiator 1, which, if you haven't seen it, it is a classic. If my younger listeners are not up on this, then you need to educate yourself in the great works of our American tradition. This is a true throwback to the sword and sandal epic genre. It was just fantastic. Russell Crowe, Joaquin Phoenix is the evil emperor, and he has to fight his way back. His wife and child are killed at the beginning, and he has to fight his way back through the gladiatorial games. It's not a good source of historical information. Do not rely on Gladiator 1 for your Roman history. But I will say that I think movies like that really just work as movies and are good, solid, fun action that people love and that I love and that kind of get the spirit of some of that Roman vigor and fight are fantastic gateways. They're fantastic inroads, which is why I was so bummed that Gladiator 2 completely sucked. And if you are with me and you are still in a funk about how bad Gladiator 2 was, boy, have I got the antidote for you today. It's Book 5 of the Aeneid. Book 5 of the Aeneid will reset your palate and get you excited about Roman games again, because it's fight night. This is a really fun book. None of the books of the Aeneid are skippable by any means. They're all awesome, but this one is kind of like an intermission. So we're just going to do one episode on Book 5. We've been spending a lot of time in Book 4 with Dido, because that is a true giant of the epic genre. It has loomed over Western literature and art ever since it was first written and read. And so we really dwelled in that and talked a lot about that relationship and the lead up to it. We have another giant book coming up. Book 6 is kind of the hinge point of the entire poem. It's going to take us from part 1, which is the section based on the Odyssey, where Aeneas is wandering about and trying to find his purpose, his direction, his ultimate goal. And he has to get kind of shocked out of his distractedness and his uncertainty by the Dido episode. And in some ways, you might say that's his low point. And then he's going to now descend into the underworld, which is a classic part of the hero's journey. The Greeks called it the katabasis, going down into the house of the dead. And there he is going to truly transform. He's going to come up changed, as heroes always do, and he will move on to fight for Italy. And that's books 7 through 12, the second half of the poem, kind of act 2 of the poem, based on the Iliad, which is Homer's epic of war. So we are really approaching now kind of it's not the pinnacle of the poem exactly, but it is the heart of the poem. And I think Virgil very purposefully gives us a little bit of a breather, like a palate cleanser or an intermission. And that's book 5. But there's lots of interesting stuff that happens here. And in particular, there is stuff that can reset us from the misery of watching Gladiator 2. If you haven't seen it, I really can't recommend it except in the way that you might want to watch like The Room, one of the worst movies ever made. It's so stupid. It does have the same kind of format, in fact, almost to a fault. It's one of those sequels that just lifts the template of the original up out of its like original context and repurposes it and sticks new characters in there, casts Pedro Pascal, which seems to be the thing that directors think they can do to fix any movie now, and then romps along through all of these fights that make no sense, many of which are totally fantastical, like there are sharks in the Colosseum. That stuff doesn't bother me so much because I actually like historical embellishments. Like I said, it's nobody, you shouldn't go to these movies looking for historical information anyway. But when one of the characters walks into an ancient Roman cafe where I think it's a senator is reading the Daily Roma, a Roman newspaper, that was when I just about lost it. I mean, it's such a dumb movie. Denzel Washington is in there doing his Denzeliest to try and lift it into a certain degree of like campy fun, and he certainly chews the scenery, but it just like, it was such a mess and such a shame because the first one really had a certain degree of spirit and vigor. It was about something, and it was also great action, and Russell Crowe was terrific in it. So that's one of my favorite movies. You should go back and watch it if you want. And now with the Aeneid, we are not exactly going to get gladiator fights. Obviously there aren't gladiator fights in the world of Aeneas. Virgil is looking back to a time before there was Rome and before the gladiator fights had come into being. But gladiator fights were a huge part of Virgil's contemporary life. And more generally, the ludi, they were called, the games, were a huge part of the Augustan era. You may have heard the famous accusation that the Roman Empire was about bread and circuses. And that's kind of from the later empire when things really got bad. But spectacle, games, and gladiator fights, but also chariot races and foot races and wrestling and all sorts of games, many of which came from the Greek context, from the Greek tradition, where we get like the Olympics and stuff. Those were a huge part of the Augustan reign and the Augustan revival of Roman culture. And so since Virgil has to take Aeneas and kind of make him into the emblematic hero for all of Rome and show how these new or revived Roman customs of Augustan Rome, he has to take those and show that they are part of Rome's prehistory. They're embedded into the mythic past. That's part of what he's trying to do with this poem. And so in order to do that, he has to kind of make sure Aeneas stops off at all the major points along the way that can justify and endorse and explain Roman customs. He's not only here to back Augustus. He's not only trying to make Augustus look good, but he is trying to give the Romans a sense of their identity that is rooted in deep time, that is rooted in mythological past, that can rival the great myths of the Greeks, the founding myths of the great Greek cities, and that can make people feel good again about Rome. Because, again, Augustus is trying to reestablish peace and prosperity and security after 100 years of civil war. And Rome has gone through profound changes, dramatic, traumatic changes and transformations, including the end of the republican form of government, which means that in many ways the Romans might feel as if they're totally cut off from their past. They're totally disconnected from all of the things that made them Roman, and chief among those were the republican institutions. And so one of the things that Virgil is trying to do here is he's trying to say we're still Romans. In fact, this Augustan age, this new age of empire, has always been our destiny. It's written into the stars. It's part of the trajectory of history that has brought us to this point. Everything was leading up to this, even though we didn't know it at the time, maybe. But he puts these prophecies into the poem, and he puts these, what are called etiologies, stories of causation, about how things came to be, into the poem as a way of giving the Romans back their history, reconnecting them to their history, which is a kind of beautiful artistic task. It's a complicated, morally complicated artistic task. There's a lot of sadness to it, and there's a lot of sadness to this poem about leaving things behind, things falling apart. That's a lot of what we've talked about so far in this series, is Troy burns, Creusa dies, Dido kills herself, right? There's a huge amount of loss that Virgil is acknowledging. But in many ways, from now on, we're going to start to turn our attention toward building things, right? And this is true in every revolutionary era, every moment of great turmoil and transition. There's a lot of ruin in a nation, as they say. There's a lot of like loss and mourning. And then there's always somebody who comes along and says, okay, now it's time to build. And so Virgil wants to give us both of those here. And he's going to start in a kind of light way, I think, with this series of games and entertainments. I say light, I mean, these were not trifles to the Romans, and we're going to get into all of the things that they meant, what the significance of them was. And if you think about it, even our sports games, even though we think of them as entertainments, they also have connections to our past and to our local allegiances and all of that. And all of that is here. But like I say, it's a bit of an intermission. So just to recap, right? We've been through Aeneas's low point, I think, of the journey. Troy was destroyed. His home was destroyed. He lost his wife. He salvaged the only stuff he could, which was his son, Aeneas, his father, Anchises, so the two generations on either side of him. You've got youth, manhood, and old age. He has his lares and penates, his household gods, the sort of representatives, the symbols of his domestic allegiance and of his family and of the divine favor that is kind of looking over him in the person of his mother, Venus, and connecting him to the divine destiny. But he's just one guy, and he's got this kind of huge task. He's not really up to it. A bunch of other people who have fled from Troy are coming with him. He stops off in places that are kind of not quite right. Like he stops off in other settlements that other Trojans have made that really feel a bit lost in the past or stuck in the past. He goes on from there knowing he's got something to do, but not quite sure what. So he's really wandering. He's really lost. Then even his father is taken from him. Anchises, remember, dies in Sicily. And that is probably the point at which Aeneas finally loses all of his conviction and direction, because he then washes up ashore in Carthage, in North Africa, after Juno, the goddess who hates him, sends a storm. And that brings us to the part where Virgil and Dido have their doomed love affair. And the reason it goes so badly, or one of the reasons it goes so badly, is because Aeneas has so totally lost his way that he just kind of melts into the background. And Dido becomes the main character, but she is also being manipulated by Venus, who is manipulating Juno in this giant chain of kind of deceit that ends them up in this disastrous love affair. And Aeneas has to be kind of jolted out of that by Zeus and Hermes, who come in and remind him of his destiny. And he then has to leave her, which he does imperfectly, but with resolution. And I really think that decision, that moment, which is also standing in for the moment of Rome's conflict in history, the Roman Republic's historical conflict with Carthage, the empire, which kind of set that conflict. We talked about the Punic Wars. That conflict basically set Rome's destiny. It confirmed that Rome was going to be the major power in the Mediterranean, and even if they didn't know it at the time, looking back, it really was the thing that settled it, that Rome was going to become this great power. And in much the same way, Aeneas leaving Dido is disastrous and destructive, but it is also the beginning, I think, of his character transformation. His low point is the love affair. The decision to leave, which is the hardest decision, but also the right decision, that starts to turn him into the hero that he needs to be. He finally starts to take over some agency, and he starts to step up into the role that his father was kind of playing for him. Anchises was sort of giving the mission its direction, which is part of why his death was so devastating and why it left Aeneas so at a loss. And now he's stepping up into that role and beginning to come truly, finally of age and come into his own. So, among other things, this is a story about how an individual man grows to the stature of the head of his household. And, of course, that's an important Roman value also, that when your father is alive, he's still in some sense in charge. Now he's gone. Aeneas has to really become the man he's meant to be. So that's where we left him. And now his great transformative trial is ahead of him. They set out into the ocean. They know that they know basically where they're bound. But lo and behold, at this very moment when they were so excited to leave, a giant storm appears. And this, at first, is very confusing. Storms, in general, in literature, in epic literature, are symbols of misdirection, confusion. We began the poem with one. So this is sort of a head fake on Virgil's part, right? We think that we're now embarking. We've settled the Dido issue. It was very painful, but now full steam ahead. Oh no, here's another storm. Do we really have to face yet more confusion and turmoil and trial? And part of what Virgil is saying here is, yes, we've now turned in the right direction. Virgil has embarked, or rather Aeneas has embarked on the journey to become the man he needs to be, but it's just the beginning of the journey. The turn and the direction is everything, but the journey still lies ahead. So in some ways, we're back where we started with a storm. And there is a description of it that is just one of Virgil's great strengths, I think, is describing scenery and setting the scene and depicting these enormous and majestic kind of landscapes. And this description also introduces us to a very important character for this book, whose name is Palinurus. And Palinurus is the helmsman. He is the guy that steers the ship. So we're going to get into the symbolism of that in a bit, but let me just first read to you this passage, which I have, as always, translated out of the Latin into English Alexandrine lines. And when the vessels took to sea, no land in sight, with ocean everywhere, and everywhere the sky, then overhead there stood a storm cloud, dark with rain, and thick with night and winter, shadowing the waves. The very helmsman, Palinurus, from his perch, said, "Oh, what brings such heavy squalls to choke the air? What is it, Father Neptune, that you have in store?" And then he gave the order to assemble gear and heave away, all hands upon the solid oars, to turn the ships oblique against the wind. He said, "Great-souled Aeneas, not if Jupiter himself should promise us our safety, would I hope to reach the shores of Italy beneath a sky like this. That howling from the black lair of the evening star is all the winds that rise and turn against us, and the air itself is growing dense with clouds." So one thing we learn from this is that this is going to be a book about Neptune's relationship to Aeneas. And it's an interesting one, because Neptune, I think of Neptune in epic a little bit like the uncle god. He's the uncle figure in the family of the gods. First of all, because he is the brother of the king. Neptune and Zeus and Hades, the god of the underworld, are kind of this trio, the three brothers. And Zeus runs the skies and the cosmos, the world. Neptune runs the seas, and Hades runs the underworld. And so Neptune is kind of like this third wheel a little bit. And he has this uncle kind of character in that your uncle is always the guy who comes in, and sometimes you have an awesome uncle that you love and he's really fun, and sometimes your uncle's a little weird, and sometimes he's kind of you don't like him very much. And think about when you're a kid and your uncle comes over, all the different associations. It's just a little bit peripheral, a little bit oblique to your family, and you're just not quite sure. That's kind of Neptune, because he's Odysseus's great foe. He's the one in the Odyssey who is trying to stop. He's sort of the Juno figure. Juno is the antagonist in the Aeneid. Neptune is the antagonist in Odysseus, because Odysseus kills Polyphemus, the Cyclops, and defends Neptune. Here, he has actually been friendly in the past. Book 1, when there's a storm and Juno sends the storm, Neptune has to come in and calm the waves, and he's sort of like a Roman senator figure. He has this big speech that he makes, and he's compared to a statesman. So we are favorably inclined here. We think he's on our side, and yet the seas are always confusing, always fickle, always maybe changing things up. And the question that Palinurus asks is the one that we, I think, have to ask here is, what are you up to, Neptune, right? What do the gods have in mind? And why, in this moment when it seemed like they had just told him to leave, remember that Hermes from Zeus came down and said, this is what you have to do. So all of the ambiguity and the confusion that usually attaches to mankind's relationship with the divine has just been thoroughly and conclusively dispelled. Aeneas knows that his quest lies in the direction of Italy, and then all of a sudden, what gives? What the heck, man? Like, a storm. So what's Neptune up to? What's going on? And it turns out that as the book unfolds, we realize there is actually kind of a point to this, that what the Romans end up having to do is make land in Sicily again. And when they're there, they realize that, in fact, it's been a year since Anchises died. And so this is kind of one of those moments of providence where you're like, what are you, I think people who have a relationship with God know this feeling. We're like, what are you up to, God? Like, I thought that my direction was here, and suddenly you're throwing this obstacle in my way. Oh, wait, like there is a story being told that I am part of, and it has a certain rhythm and an art to it. And obviously Virgil is the one creating that rhythm here, but the gods are the authors of Aeneas' story in the ultimate sense. And there is a point here that it is fitting they should stop off in Sicily on their way for a number of reasons, one of which is that they need to honor the 1-year anniversary of Anchises' death. And there is an incredible appropriateness here. There's a lot of sort of narrative construction going on, narrative care being taken here by Virgil, because, as I've just said, we have had Aeneas's grief. We've had his year of grief, which, like many years of grief, has involved a kind of breakdown. It has involved Aeneas going astray and making bad choices and getting lost and feeling alone. And now he's going to have closure, because he has moved past, in some ways, by making his choice to move on and to leave Dido. He's moved past that grief. He's gotten out of the depths of the doldrums, and now he's going to have closure by celebrating his father's life, essentially, throwing games in his honor. And this was a thing in Rome. This was a big Roman tradition. Obviously, ancestral piety, that is filial piety, honoring your parents, was a huge Roman value in general. It was part of what they believed had kept them virtuous for so long. It was called the mos maiorum, the respect of the elders, respect of the generation before you. And funerals were a big part of that. Funerals are described in great detail by Polybius, the Greek historian, who tells us what were the customs and the institutions that defined Roman civilization and Roman greatness. Funerals are one of them, and they are always theatrical. They are always a big spectacle for honored men. When they die, they get a lot of fanfare in public, and part of the fanfare is often like a kind of theatrical performance where the members of the family wear masks embodying the spirits of the other noble ancestors. And so already when you go to give a funeral or celebrate or commemorate a great man, there's going to be some kind of show, which is not really how we think of funerals. I mean, we do think of honoring people. We do think of giving speeches and honoring our fathers and our mothers, especially with ritual. But we typically think of that as a private affair. We think of it as something that only pertains to the family and close friends and relatives. Romans did not think of it that way. They thought of it as a civic event, something that was of public concern because it helped to stitch civilization and society together. It kept people in mind of their obligations to the past, their obligations to their families, and to the Roman state. So this was a hugely important civic institution, is the funeral. And part of it was the ludi funebres, they were called, the funeral games, essentially. These are games that were celebrated around the death pyre, or in some fashion or another. You not only would have this kind of theatrical performance, you would also sometimes have games. And games are, in Rome, as I said, a kind of big custom, big tradition anyway, right? Shows of athletic excellence, displays of strength, displays of heroism and competition. And they go back to the Iliad and the Odyssey as well. And when we did our series on the Iliad and the Odyssey, we talked about all the things that sports can do. So if you want to go back and listen to those episodes, I'll drop the link into the description of this one here. But the tradition of this is very deep rooted. There's a connection to that mythic ancestral past. But there's also something uniquely Roman about this particular kind of celebration because of the mos maiorum, because honoring your father is a way of acknowledging the greatness of the past of your ancestors, but also a way of living up to that greatness, stepping into that role, which is, again, what Aeneas is tasked with doing here. So the gods actually knew what they were doing by running him aground in Sicily, because they knew he needed to do this in some way, or at least Virgil knew he needed to do this. And so the storm here turns out to be more of an interlude than an obstacle. And as I said at the very beginning, it's also an explanation, or I think a depiction of the gladiatorial games. Now, that's not made explicit here. It's not something that Virgil definitely tells us. But again, these games were very important for Augustus. He had a lot of different kinds of performances that he liked to put on. Famously, he had a festival called the Ludi Saeculares, which was an ancient festival that he revived. And then the gladiatorial fights as well were just a mainstay at this point of Roman culture. And the other reason why I think that that's part of what's going on here is because the gladiatorial games were said to have developed first during the Carthaginian Wars. This is something that we get from Livy, the great Roman historian. Livy has a huge, epic, monumental history of Rome. Not all of it comes down to us, and unfortunately, this is part of it that we only get in a small portion. They're called summaries, perioci. And so we get a summary of book 16 of Livy's history, which is about 264 BC, the first year of the Punic War. And part of that, 1616, is to honor his father. We get in the summary, we read, to honor his father, Decimus Junius Brutus was the first one to organize gladiatorial games. Brutus, this is not Brutus who killed Caesar. It's obviously many hundreds of years before that, but it is actually only important. This guy is basically only important because of this note, because we hear that he threw games to celebrate his father that then turned into the gladiatorial combats. And there is a lot of hand-to-hand combat in the Aeneid. Again, this is a little bit like of an Easter egg hunt that I'm doing here, and I'm sure that people have noticed this before. I thought this was really cool when I discovered it, or when I started to trace these connections. And this is one of the things that you can do with a poem as great as the Aeneid, is you can just go on these little chases around every little portion. And so this is why I say there are no skippable books, right? This is a bit of an interlude book, but there's still meaning and richness and significance in everything that is going on. And I really think that the idea that Aeneas, who, remember, has just had his Carthaginian War, right? He's just had his conflict with Carthage. He's now, right after that, he's honoring his father with a bunch of games. And you then take that and you say, okay, in the first year of the Punic War, the first Punic War where Rome clashed with Carthage, we are told this guy honored his father, and it turned into the gladiatorial games, this great Roman institution. So I really think that's what this is about here. Obviously, it's fun to read about the heroes doing their different races, and there's a boat race and a foot race and a giant kind of boxing match. They're all really cool, and I'm not going to go over each one of them in detail. You should go and read it if you want, but I love that they are probably there also to show this is something we've always done, right? Even if the modern, quote-unquote modern for Virgil, tradition of the Ludi and the gladiatorial games kind of starts with the Carthaginian War, the Punic War, that has precedent, he's saying, in our ancestral past, in our founding myth. And so it then therefore also links us to the Homeric heroes and to those who went before us. And so you're taking here a Roman custom of honoring your father with a game and of connecting your present generation to the generations that went before and acknowledging your obligations. And he's expanding that, blowing that up into like big time, into the mythological past of Aeneas. Very, very cool little grace note or gesture that that Virgil is doing here, giving Aeneas a kind of gladiatorial fight to do. This is going on for the first part of the book. That's kind of how they occupy themselves while they're running around in Sicily. Then it's always something. And so meanwhile, Juno is plotting her next mischief, her next foolishness. At this point, Juno is really down bad. Like, she has basically lost the fight with the death of Dido. She's always kind of known that her endeavor is doomed, but as a goddess, she really can't accept this, and also she is kind of a force of nature. She just, if she's not going to get her way, ultimately, she's still going to make it as difficult and painful as possible for the Trojans to make their way to found what will become Rome. And so she's trying to think up ways that she can throw obstacles in their way. And this is very different from the Neptune version, right? Where maybe there's a little bit of avuncular mischief going on. Maybe we're not totally sure of him. And we still have kind of an open question mark about what's Neptune's relationship to Aeneas, that we're going to come back to later. But Juno, we know what she wants. She wants pain. She wants him to suffer. And in some ways, she's even angrier now because of the death of Dido, because of the way her darling has been hurt. So now she's going to interfere in a different way by driving the women insane. So one of the things about the ludi, the spectacles, the games, which are what Aeneas and his bros are doing right now, is that they're man's business. They are something that basically dudes do. There are some exceptions. We have some famous myths of women that participated, but in Roman culture, this is kind of a guy's thing. You can think of it as fight night, right? It's the boys' night out together, and they're kind of letting off a little steam in addition to, gaining closure on this traumatic episode. And so the women are off doing something else, something. This is a little bit of like again, this is boys' night. And that's what Juno takes advantage of when she decides that she's going to incite a kind of insurrection among the women, a girls' insurrection. So instead of doing what women sometimes do when there's guys' night, which is have girls' night, right? Like book club, or I'm being like so stereotypical here, but like, sipping Chardonnay and hanging out. Instead, they decide to burn the Trojan ships, which is probably not the most productive use of that time, if we're being completely honest. But again, like with Dido, there are extenuating circumstances here, because what's actually going on is that Juno sends Iris, whom you may remember from book 4. She is the messenger goddess who lives in the rainbow. The rainbow goes wherever she goes. And she was last seen liberating Dido's soul from her body, which she does very dramatically and beautifully. Now she's going to stir dissension among the women who have legitimate grievances, legitimate causes for complaint, because they have been, as always in these war stories, right? There's kind of a long tradition in ancient literature of acknowledging or paying attention to the fact that while the men are out civilization building, the women are the ones who really have to kind of just take it, like they have to suffer, and their world is upended by the men's wars and the men's traveling and the foundation of the city and everything. It's very difficult to do what in Virgil's world was woman's work, right? It's very difficult to kind of like found a home and create a society, and it's unsettling. It's upsetting for anyone to be in that condition, but it's especially upsetting, I think, for these women who don't really have a lot of control over their destiny, right? They're being kind of dragged along. They've been in terrible, dire straits forever, for a long time, ever since Troy fell, and now they are going to be stirred up to riot by kind of like their worst nature. So what Iris does is she disguises herself as Beroe. Gods and goddesses famously very good at taking on the appearance and voice of humans that they choose to imitate. Beroe is one of the women who is off away somewhere, and now Iris uses this opportunity to basically turn into a version of this respected woman and make the case that these women are hard done by and they need to like put up a fight. And it's interesting, this idea of like the women rebelling is totally part of ancient literature. We get it in the Lysistrata, famously from Aristophanes, the Greek comedy, where they rebel against war, right? They go on a sex strike, essentially. And a lot of it is recognizable from our modern dealings with feminism. So when you have feminism in like modern civilizations, the various waves of feminism have often gone something like this arrangement that we have where we split the labor or we split the trial and the suffering between men and women, for whatever reason, no longer is working. And you have, let's say, for example, in pre-industrial societies, you have like the cottage industry where the man goes out and does some of the manual labor and the woman kind of takes the products of that and stitches and sews and spins them. And it's not true. We have this modern caricature of this that like that meant that only men were involved in economic life or business life. It's actually that the way the economy was set up at the time, this was the collaboration. The physical labor was best done by larger, stronger men. The domestic labor was best done by women. But if you read, for example, like Proverbs 31, where the good woman is described, it's not like she's not working. She's working very hard. She's like kneading dough and she's going out and buying a field in the morning, but she's doing the female part of the labor while the man is out doing the male part of the labor. And then something changes, conditions change, and those arrangements don't make as much sense anymore, or they get upset. Like industrial technology totally upended that. And you get these women's movements, right? You get women's movements which at their best say, let's collaborate on rearranging this situation. At their worst, however, they take that real problem, which is a change of relations between the sexes, and they use it in service of a kind of resentment, right? They say, well, this is just all oppression to begin with. This is all a plot on men's part to keep us down. And that's not quite what goes on here, but there is a sense that, you know, the men and the women have been shouldering different parts of this burden. The men have been voyaging and fighting and building, trying to do stuff. The women have been kind of trying to keep the home fires burning as best they can, which is very scary and difficult. And now they're basically at their last straw. Like this arrangement worked okay when it seemed like maybe we were going to just hop over next door and found a new settlement. Suddenly we're in this wilderness and the leader's off doing who knows what with Dido, right? And this has all gotten a bit much. And so one can imagine that their patience is already thin when Iris shows up to stir dissension. And in fact, like, they have a point to, or they have a reason to ask, like, what is this, you know? And often I think in families you get this where the man is like, we are going to move to South Carolina and I'm going to start a business and a factory. And it's like, you know, the wife is always like, are you sure? Like, the dutiful wife will go with the man, but for a while, and then in the depths of it, when things look confusing and the man's not certain where he's going, it starts to really grate and wear on the women. And that's kind of what Iris exploits when she says, enough is enough. These men, they don't know what they're doing. They are totally lost and they're causing us misery. We suffer the worst of it, right? It's an unequal bargain, unequal partnership. And so let's burn the ships. Let's destroy their fleet so they have to stop. She makes this speech, and there's a great little passage where they sort of think about it, try to decide, and then they are overawed. I mean, again, it's not totally that these women are just like bad feminazis. It's that they are being manipulated by a hostile force that's driving them insane, which we get a lot in this poem. So there's a famous unfinished line. Remember that Virgil did die without completing this poem, and so there are some lines that aren't totally complete. And one of them is at the end of Beroe's speech. The narrator says, "Haec ephata." That's what she said, or having spoken this, she spoke this. And that's the whole line. So it's a very short little weird unfinished. I think this is a good example of a line that really is kind of unfinished. There's not much reason for it to end this way. And there's a gap. And then we have this great description. But then at first, the matron's minds were split in two. They cast an evil eye upon the ship. And the weird deformity of this, which I'm trying to get across in the English, is there in the poem, in the Latin. They are ancipites. They are literally two-headed. So this is a way in which the goddess is starting to turn them like into kind of monsters. But they're not all bad. They're trying to kind of resist this. They're not sure. They're uncertain. At first, the matron's minds were split in two. They cast an evil eye upon the ships and wavered between their melancholy love for where they were and fate, which called them onward into unknown realms. So they know that Aeneas has got this mission. It's not lost on them. It's just that they're so tired and they want to stay here. And fate is calling them onto unknown realms. But then suddenly the goddess reared herself aloft and spread her balanced wings in flight across the sky. She cut across the clouds and left a soaring arc. Then, well and truly overawed by spectacle and driven on by frenzied rage, they cry aloud and snatch the fire from the sanctuary torches. So this is an act of true impiety, right? They're grabbing sacred flame that's used for ritual. Some set to pillaging the altars, fronds and branches, torches piled up to let the flame god Vulcan rage along the crossbeams and the painted prows. So this is obviously a disaster. Aeneas has interrupted in his boys' night with the news that the women are up to some foolishness, and he has to like run and put the fires out, and it's a real like crisis between the two sexes, and obviously a huge threat to the future voyage. They manage to salvage enough of the fleet to carry on, but they also have to. Interestingly, they don't just say, and now women, like, get back into the ships, right? They actually take a beat to let the fervor of the divine madness die down, and then address the underlying concerns. I find this actually quite moving, that there's a blow up, right? There's tensions that have been simmering. They've been exploited by the gods. There's a blow up. And then they say, well, okay, like, what were the things that made you vulnerable to this, right? Like, we've had this terrible fight, but what were the underlying concerns that you were already having that made you vulnerable to this fit of passion and outrage? And they ultimately make the decision that they're going to give an off-ramp, a last chance exit, right? This is last stop before Rome. We're going to let people, we're in fact going to build you a settlement, a little Troy. And remember, we've seen many little Troys on this journey. There have been a number of places where we see like kind of mini Troys getting built as a way of housing the people that don't want to go on, don't have energy, can't go on. And they create a settlement for the members of their crew who are simply exhausted. They're spent, they have nothing left, and they're going to stay behind essentially in Sicily. So that's the solution they come up with here as a way of acknowledging the problems that led the women to the point where they were able to be manipulated by Juno and Iris, but also as a way of shedding any people who are not completely on mission. And that, too, I think, is a sign that Aeneas now is a man with a goal and a plan. He knows that he has to descend into the underworld. He knows that he can't mess around anymore. And so he's just going to say, look, if you're not with me, no hard feelings. But this is where we leave you. Like, you can take your resentments and you can stay behind. And so this is a way, basically, of winnowing down his crew to just those who are really committed and ready to go to Italy. The last thing, then, that happens is that the seas are starting to look favorable. They're starting to get ready to go on. And we have a council of the gods where, for lack of a better phrase, Venus and Neptune have a come-to-Jesus moment. Where Venus, remember, Aeneas' big advocate in heaven, has the support of Zeus. That's been made clear for some time, and Zeus has repeatedly insisted, yes, I'm with you. And now she has to say, like, what is really going on here? Neptune, are you for us or against us? What's your deal? And they have this divine council. We kind of, the scene shifts, and we get this conversation between the two of them, in which finally the uncle decides that he's going to be a good uncle, or at least he reassures us that he's going to be a good uncle. He doesn't mean any mischief. He's just trying to coordinate the journey in the best way possible. And there are certain things that are, and this is a very important word, certain things that are fas, that are right. And that encompasses not just morally right, but fitting, appropriate. And so this journey that Aeneas is on also has to hit all of the stages. And Neptune says, I'm just trying to do that, just trying to help you make this journey work at its maximal level. And he reminds Venus that he was the one that rescued Aeneas from Troy, which is true. This is the first instance in the epic tradition that we have of Aeneas' mission is in Homer's Iliad, when Aeneas is raring to go up against Achilles. He's fixing, itching for a fight, and Neptune says, no, we need to preserve him, save him for another day, because he has this destiny to carry on the Trojan line. And that's what he reminds Venus of here, and tells her rather, that ultimately he's got Aeneas' best interests at heart. Here's what he says. He says, you're right, Cytherea, that's Venus, you're right, Cytherea, to trust in my domains, from which your birth derives. Venus was born from the foam of the sea. You're right, Cytherea, to trust in my domains, from which your birth derives. I've merited it well. I've stifled raging frenzy in the sky and sea. Remember book 1, right? Remember when I calmed the waves that Juno incited? On land, let Xanthus and Simois testify. So even when you're not in my realms, the rivers, who are my servants, can also testify to my concern for your Aeneas. When Achilles drove the panicked Trojans hard against their walls and sent them in their thousands down to death, they groaned, those rivers, stuffed and blocked from rolling on their way, and Xanthus couldn't find the sea. This is a major episode in Homer when the corpses choke the river up. But it was I who snatched away Aeneas when his strength fell short, and gods abandoned him within a hollow cloud. Despite my wish to tear the walls of faithless Troy, constructed by my hands, and cast them to the ground. This is why Neptune, by the way, is a little bit of an unknown quantity, because he's mad at Troy. He has this beef with Troy, but he's saying, I like Aeneas, right? I'm on Aeneas' side, and my intentions haven't changed. Dispel your fears. He'll reach Avernus at the harbor of your choosing. Only one life lost, engulfed beneath the waves. One man for many will be given up. And that's Palinurus. So the whole thing comes full circle. This book is a really nice little self-contained unit. We began with Palinurus saying, Neptune, what are you up to? Then now Neptune is telling us what he's up to, and it's very poignant because on the one hand, Neptune is going to help them move on in their journey. On the other hand, unum pro multis dabitur caput. One man will be sacrificed to the past in order to make the future possible. Now, this is a line that has been much remarked upon because in the Christian tradition, Virgil is often thought of as an almost pagan prophet. He almost sees, among the things that he's describing with this poem, in describing the end of the Roman Republic, the beginning of a new era, the Roman Empire, it almost seems as if he can see that the new age that's coming is going to wipe the entire pagan world away. And T.S. Eliot has written about this. Dante obviously used Virgil as his guide through hell, up along through purgatory, just up to the gates of Christian paradise. So there's a sense always that Virgil, because he's such an insightful poet, because he can see the end of something, the end of an age and the beginning of a new one, maybe he can even see that there is a king even greater coming, a great king of the world. And the classic example of this is his fourth eclogue, where he prophesies the birth of a son who will bring in a new age. And some people think this is Augustus, some people think this is Augustus' son, who knows? But a lot of people think it looks a lot like a Christ figure. And here too, Palinurus looks kind of like a Christ figure. He is the leader, he's the head of the fleet. He's the one who has steered them this far, but now, as a sacrifice to the ocean, a sacrifice to the sea, he has to die for everyone else to go along, and for Neptune's grudge against Troy to be finally set into set to rest. Your mileage may vary. I find this stuff very suggestive. I don't think Virgil was sitting around being like, yes, there's going to be this guy called Jesus. He's going to fulfill the prophecies of the Jews. But I do think that great artists can see the shape of their time. And sometimes you can discern where that shape is going, see the contours of things. And Virgil definitely knew that there was a big period being put on history. The movement that began with Aeneas was ending or coming to its consummation with the Roman Empire, and something new was coming. And there's always a sense in Virgil that there is like a true world transformation in the making, on the horizon. And this little moment when Palinurus has to die for all, one for many, is another instance where you think, man, Virgil, what did you see? What did you know? But that puts a period, right, on at least this part of Aeneas' journey. This is a little intermission on the way to what we will talk about next week, which is the Catabasis, probably my favorite book of the Aeneid. Certainly the hinge point. We've reached really the place where the poem takes on its fullest expression of what it's about, and that's this descent into the underworld. It's very, very famous. It's been redone a million times. It's another part, of course, of why Dante uses Virgil as his guide in the Inferno. It's been reworked by Seamus Heaney and all sorts of modern poets. This is truly, we are now at the place where Virgil is about to transform Roman literature and world literature and Western literature forever. Whatever you might think about his relationship to Homer, people like Homer better. Some people like Homer better. Some people think Virgil's just a knockoff. I think that's doing him a terrible disservice. For most of Western history, this poem has been viewed as a hinge point in literature. And we're starting, I think, to see why, because it's so well constructed. It's so smart about the way that there is greatness in the past, but that greatness is ending, and now something new is beginning. We're about to see, in no uncertain terms, what that new thing is. That's what we're going to get in the underworld next time. I can't wait to do this next book with you. But first, I'm also excited to bring you It Figures. This is the section of the show where I like to talk about language, because it's obviously super fun to do the story and the significance and the myths and the illusions and the history and all of that. But it's also just cool to look at how Virgil uses poetic language. And one way of doing that is to think about figures of speech, that is, tendencies, things that poets always use, techniques for rhetoric and for constructing language. And we have names for these that come from the epic tradition, and or from the ancient tradition, rather. I like to share these with you. This time around, I want to go back to the very first section that I read to you about striking out upon the ocean. And there's something that goes on here that goes on throughout all of Virgil, all of epic poetry, in fact, that we haven't yet talked about, but it's everywhere in poetry of this time. And that's elision, with an E, E-L-I-S-I-O-N. And this is a word that just describes when two vowels are next to each other. When you have a word that ends with a vowel and then a word that begins with a vowel, those vowels get smushed together and they become one metrical unit, which is important, especially for Greek and Latin poetry, because the whole thing is based on metrical units, based on the length of vowels. And so when you smush those lengths together, then you get basically two vowels for the price of one. You've only used one syllable in your metrical structure, but you have also put two words together. And it's a way of word painting. It's a way of mushing words around and together and connecting concepts. And really artful poets are able to use this to great effect, both in the way the poetry sounds as a kind of song, as a way of using the melody and the music of the poem to communicate what's going on. And sometimes there are interesting little visual cues as well. And we have a great example of this in the line, Mari undiquet undique caelum. And if you know a little Latin, you can hear that there are many words smushed together there. If I read this line, or this section of this line on its own, I get Maria undique et undique caelum, which is already using one of the constructions that we've talked about before. You may remember, this will be a fun review, you may remember chiasmus, which is the X structure. It's A-B-B-A. It's like a little sandwich. And here, Maria means oceans, caelum means sky, and then undique et undique, everywhere and everywhere. And it goes like this, Maria undique caelum. I've translated as with ocean everywhere and everywhere the sky. Very satisfying construction in its own right. And here, Virgil has smushed that construction into one big lump because Maria undique becomes Mariundique. And then undique et becomes undiquet. And then you have undique caelum. So Mariundiquet undique caelum. Why is he doing this besides just making the line have the right number of syllables? Well, of course, what's he describing? He's describing this rolling ocean landscape with no land in sight, right? Everywhere the ocean, the sky everywhere, or rather, ocean everywhere and everywhere the sky. It sounds like rolling waves. Mariundiquet undique caelum. I love that sound, and that's what elision can do when it's used really well. We also have elision in English poetry, but the difference is it's optional. So in Latin and Greek poetry, elision is just the standard thing that happens. It happens whenever you smush two words together that one ends with a vowel and one begins with a vowel. It also happens in Latin even when you have a um ending, so you can smush across over the m at the end of the accusative case if you are interested in that sort of thing, or there are other words that end in m and those get smushed together too. So it's very standard. It sounds natural. It would sound unnatural not to do it. On the other hand, in English, it actually sounds a little bit more sometimes like a cheat, or it sounds slightly affected and artificial. And that's because you can choose when you're writing English poetry whether to do elision. People don't tend to do it as much nowadays. It's more common in the past, and the place you hear it most often, I think, these days is in hymns. Songs generally, but hymns especially. There's a song, for example, that goes, "Let us sing psalms with heart and mind, and to the apostles let us cling." So you can hear the rhythm of that, la-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, and to make it work, the apostles becomes the apostles. You would never say the apostles, although we do tend to slur our vowels together sometimes in regular speech, but not in the same way, not in that rhythmic way. In hymns and in songs, you get it a lot. You'll see it now everywhere as you read poetry, but you'll notice that poets in English can choose whether or not to do this. In Latin, it's another one of these constraints. It's almost like a mathematical rule. And so it takes a lot of artistry in both English and in Latin. But for Virgil to get that line so nicely hammered out is a good example. He has a chiasmus with elision that gives you the picture of the sea. And I'm going to read it one more time because I just love the sound. Mariundiquet undique caelum. All right, that's It Figures, the little section on how poets do poetry. Finally, I have a mailbag question that I'm excited to take. Mailbag questions come to me through Substack. So if you are not already, please become a subscriber of my Substack at rejoiceevermore.substack.com. That's where you will read all of my interesting musings about this sort of stuff. Right now, there's an essay up there called "What Language Did Adam Speak?", which I'm particularly proud of. I'm getting a lot of nice feedback from you guys on it. So go ahead and subscribe. You can become a paid subscriber if you want to support me. And no matter what, if you're a subscriber, you can be in the mailbag. You can write to me through the DMs feature of Substack. And that is the way that you can ask me things. So here's a question from Prismatic Orthodox. He says, "I recently started reading poetry after being introduced to some famous poems through your podcast." Hey, that's a win. Another chalk one up for the Young Heretics team. Eliot, Tennyson, Wyatt, wonderful. Okay. And a while back on the show, I recommended a book called The Making of a Poem, which helps if you want to understand poetic form, if poetry is not something you've ever gotten into and you're a little confused about what the point is of all these lines and line breaks and why they look the way they do, the kind of stuff we talk about when we talk about It Figures, The Making of a Poem is a great little introduction. This has been my first exposure, says Prismatic Orthodox, to verse forms and meter and how they are used to tap into a larger tradition. It's also been interesting to learn that the ancient poets writing on their own in their own language use different meters to evolve different emotions from their audience. Yes, I mean, we've been talking all about this, right? Virgil is using dactylic hexameter. There are different rules for Latin rhythm and versus English meter and all of that. Some of them are lost when translated or changed. All of this had me thinking, do any of the books of poetry in the Bible, the Psalms, the Song of Solomon, or Job, have any specific meter or form that doesn't translate well into English? And if so, are there any translations you are aware of that have a primary intent of preserving the poetic form? Ooh, boy, do they ever. And I am so glad you asked me this because we don't talk about this nearly enough. We don't talk about the poetry of the Bible. Nowadays, sometimes people will raise this, but our translations really don't have a good way of getting at biblical poetry, and it is a completely separate tradition. It uses very, very different techniques to get meaning across, but it is not formless. It doesn't just do whatever it wants. And in fact, one of the things that scholars of the Bible do is they look at biblical texts to try and discern whether they are poetry using certain formal indicators. And the main one is actually the thing that we just talked about in the process of talking about Virgil, and that is chiasmus, A-B-B-A. This is something that poets love to do. It's part of the Near Eastern tradition that the Bible is within. And so if you think about these different regions as having their own poetic traditions, each poetic tradition has a different formal marker of poetry. In English, it's actually first alliteration. The old English poets use alliteration. Every line has a certain syllable or sound or consonant or vowel that it repeats again and again. We then get the introduction of rhyme gradually over time, and rhythm and meter is always kind of there present as well. And these different ingredients are part of what makes up a poem. And it's interesting that, you always have some of these ingredients in a poem. Sometimes some are more popular than others. The English tradition, as usual, pulls a bunch of different markers from different places, and there are different fashions of different times. For instance, Milton famously says about Paradise Lost, there's no rhymes in this because the ancient poets didn't rhyme, and we don't need this jingle-jangle rhyme all the time. And so now you have different schools of thought in English poetry, some of which use rhyme and rhyming forms, some of which don't. We've talked in Latin and Greek about how it's the tones and the rhythm of the line that give you the structure, that make you hear something as poetry. When I say me ninae de thea, you can instantly hear that I'm in that rhythm, and that tells you in Latin and Greek that you're in a poem. Similarly, in English, if I say, it little profits that an idle king by this still hearth among these barren crags, it sounds like speech, but you gradually start to hear there's that lilting bounce, and that's the iambic pentameter, and we're in a poem, right? So that's the kind of thing that we're talking about here, is like, what are the sounds and the markers and the patterns and the structures that make us feel like we are in a poem? And in Hebrew, there is always, in all Hebrew literature, there's a strong sense of this chiasmus, or this, it's almost symmetry. And you get it even in prose, even in the from the very first beginning, the book of Genesis, there's always kind of like a call and response thing going on, right? The birds of the air and the fish of the sea, right? There's this and that, this on the one hand, that on the other hand. In the beginning, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light, right? It's built into this that you have like this thing and this other complementary thing. And so that structure is very, very deep in what I would think of as like Semitic thought, in the sense of like this, the Bible is part of this ancient Near Eastern tradition. The languages are all related to each other. Hebrew is related to Akkadian, is related to a bunch of others, right? And this is a Semitic tradition, and this Semitic poetry has this rhythm built very deep into it. And like all poetry, it draws on the rhythms of normal speech. In fact, you might even say that poetry is kind of the most distilled form of normal speech. But there is also this special form of it, this artistic form that takes that kind of natural rhythm that's natural to the time and place and turns it into an art form and refines it and gives it all of these like recognizable patterns. It's tricky in Hebrew because it's, rhythm is something that you can formalize. Symmetry, chiasmus, parallelism, it's sometimes called, it's not always clear. Like sometimes there's a lot of parallelism, but is the whole thing really a poem? And so I would say that when you're really deep in a biblical poem, because the natural chiasmus, the natural parallelism or this and thatness of Hebrew language has been artfully constructed into an ordered whole. So the Psalms are the best example of this. A psalm is almost always a unit that is like a little interlocked nest of chiasmus upon chiasmus upon chiasmus. And it's very, very beautiful how it works. And it's key to understanding a lot of Hebrew, just in general, a lot of the Old Testament. You have to know that this is what's going on in order to see the artistry of what's being done, because it works at the level of the line, it works at the level of what you would call perhaps the stanza or the section, And then it works at the level of the whole thing. And so you'll have the whole psalm will be divided up into two chunks that answer each other. But then within each chunk, right, you might have two smaller chunks that answer each other. And then within each line, maybe you have two lines that answer each other, and each line has two sections. And this is so real a feature, this is so recognizable a feature of poetry, that there are actually little markings. If you look at a Hebrew text, you can see there's all sorts of like weird like dots and squiggles around the letters. What are those about? Well, some of them are vowels. Some of them tell you the vowels of the text. But some of them are what's called te'amim, which are cantillation marks. And those marks tell you things about where to pause in the middle of the verse, because those pauses indicate we've done one half of the chiasmus, one half of the rhythm. Now we're doing the other half, right? Ocean everywhere, pause, and everywhere the sky, right? That is the rhythm that tells you you're in a Hebrew poem when it expands out across the entire composition. In particular, there's one marking which looks like a little upside-down tuning fork. It's got like a line, and then it splits into two. They're called the etnakta, and this is this little indicator that tells you you're halfway through the line, essentially. And in fact, if you read the Liturgy of the Hours, if you go to the Book of Common Prayer, and you read the Psalms, read through the Psalms, or even actually the Canticles and just the things that Christians still recite from the Old Testament, and sometimes from the New Testament too, because remember, the New Testament has a lot of stuff that is inflected by Jewish artistic tradition, right? You will see these little asterisks in the readings, and they're in the middle of each line. So a classic example is one of the Psalms goes, "If the Lord had not been on our side, asterisk, this is Israel's song. If the Lord had not been on our side, asterisk, when men rose against us." And those asterisks, you asked whether these things can be retained in poetry. Often, or in translation rather, often the translation in the Book of Common Prayer retains the same two-part structure of the Hebrew poem. So the asterisk indicates a pause, what you might call a caesura, a break in the middle of the line, but it also often corresponds to the original break in the middle of the line, or the meaning. And so, this is stuff that is like so rich in the biblical tradition, but we never explain this anymore. People don't understand about it. So you read the Book of Common Prayer, you're like, what are these asterisks? Why are we pausing? It goes right back to this ancient form of Hebrew poetry. And that psalm that I just cited is a beautiful, wonderful example of it. So let me read it to you first, and then I'll show you kind of how this chiasmus works. So the whole psalm goes like this. If the Lord had not been on our side, this is Israel's song. If the Lord had not been on our side, when men rose against us, then would they have swallowed us alive. When their anger was kindled, then would the waters have engulfed us. The torrent gone over us, over our heads would have swept the raging waters. Blessed be the Lord who did not give us a prey to their teeth. Our life like a bird has escaped from the snare of the fowler. Indeed, the snare has been broken, and we have escaped. Our help is in the name of the Lord, who made heaven and earth. So let's start it just at the level of the line, right? And this is going on the Hebrew, but it's in the translation as well. And I'm quoting here from memory, so my Hebrew speakers, if I get some vowels wrong, please forgive me. But it's Lulai Adonai Shehaya Lanu Yomer Na Yisrael. If the Lord had not been on our side, this is Israel's song, right? Two halves. We go on. Lulai Adonai Shehaya Lanu Bakum Aleinu Adam. If the Lord had not been on our side, when men rose against us. So first you have this one idea introduced, right? If the Lord had not been on our side. And that's connected here to, this is what Israel is saying. So this is the theme, it's announcing the theme of the poem, right? If the Lord had not been on our side, what would have happened if the Lord had abandoned us? This is Israel's song. That's the first line. But then notice the second line connects back to the beginning of the first line, and then it introduces a new idea. So if the Lord had not been on our side, when men rose against us. Yeah. So now you have two lines that are connected, and within each you have two ideas that answer one another. If the Lord had not been on our side, when men rose against us. Then that line, if the Lord had not been on our side, when men rose against us, introduces a whole parallel chiastic structure. And it's amazing how the ideas follow on one another in the Hebrew. Bakum Aleinu Adam. Az Chaim B'la'unu. Then they would have swallowed us alive. Bacharot Afam Banu. When their anger was kindled against us. Right, so that's one line. So then would they have swallowed us alive, as chayim bala unu, then answers the next beginning of the next line, which is as hamayim shetafunu, then would the waters have engulfed us, hanachla avar al nefshenu, the torrent gone over us, right? Then, so we're going deeper and deeper into the water, and each idea introduces the next idea, which intensifies it, right? So then would the waters have engulfed us, the torrent gone over us, az avar al nafshenu, hamayim hazedonim. So then would the torrent gone over us, over our head would have swept the raging waters. And in the Hebrew, it's even clearer because we don't get this in the translation. We have az hamayim shetafunu, hanachla avar al nafshenu, az avar al nafsheno. That repetition of would have gone over our soul, right, is picked up again in the next line. And so each line links to the next, but also the whole thing is linked idea by idea. And then you get to the middle of it. And that's the whole stanza, right? You're deep underwater. The Lord has abandoned you and you're deep underwater. And then, suddenly, Baruch Adonai, Shelo Natananu, blessed be the Lord who did not give us a prey to their teeth. And this is the genius of it, because now we're going to climb out, right? Blessed be the Lord who did not give us a prey to their teeth. Our life, guess what our life is? Nafshenu, right? So azavar al nafshenu has been repeated. Then the waters are passing over our life, passing over our soul. Now, the Lord has not given us a prey to their teeth. Our life, like a bird, nafshenu, like a bird, katsifor, nimlata, has escaped, right? Has gone away. Mifach hayoshim, from the snare of the fowler. And then we got that idea that was introduced now, that the bird catcher didn't catch our soul. Our life like a bird has escaped from the snare of the fowler. So now we have this idea of the snare, right? The trap. And the next line is hafach nishvar. The trap is broken. So it's even more than that. We haven't just escaped. The trap is broken. Hafach nishvar. Va'enachnu nimlatnu. And we have escaped. Right, and then you have this line that is perfectly symmetrical, even in its syllables. Ezreinu b'shem Adonai, our help is in the name of the Lord. Osei shamayim va'aretz, right? Ezreinu b'shem Adonai, Osei shamayim va'aretz, puts this little button on it. But the whole thing is, we descend into the waters. If the Lord had not been on our side, we would have been under the ocean. Now we're climbing our way out like birds escaping from a broken bird catcher's trap. And what's amazing about it, the extra part that's so cool, is that what does that pairing create? It creates the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, which is a creation parallel, right? This is in creation, those two things are always linked together, the birds of the sea and the fish of the air. And they are, if you think of the world, right, as like the flat ground between the sky and the sea, they are basically two sides of one half. If you think of the orb of the world, right, with the sky above and the sea below, the ocean is where you go down into the depths and die, and then the sky is where you are released and let free. And so the whole psalm is this little picture of that. If the Lord had not been on our side, descend into the ocean, link by link by link by link, and then up, you get out of it into the air. Nafshenu katsifor, right? Like a bird, our life like a bird has escaped. It's incredibly beautiful. It's a poetry of ideas, and it has sounds that get it across, but the thing that makes it into poetry is the interlocking, careful arrangement, the kind of macrame of ideas, right? The way that this one idea links onto another, but then they build into these big ideas, and those big ideas link onto each other as well. You ask whether there are translations that get this across. I would commend to you the work of Robert Alter, who is a wonderful translator in general, but he's written a book called The Art of Biblical Poetry, which you can get on Amazon, and you can also find some of his translations of the Psalms for free online at the Poetry Foundation. So if you read Art of Biblical Poetry, he'll explain a lot of this. He'll give you his own translations of the poems as examples, and you can start to see how this works, and then you can start to discern it even in translation. What's wonderful is once you know about this, you can look at translations of the Psalms, even if you don't know Hebrew, and you can start to see the authors building these ideas together. It's an incredibly exciting, like, literary dimension of the Bible, and I'm glad you asked me. Okay, this has been so fun. Thank you as always. If you like this work, I really appreciate your support. Please do share the show. Please subscribe so you don't miss an episode. Become a paid subscriber at my Substack, and I will see you next week for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.